Welcome to the Secret Lives channel.
The ink on the divorce papers had barely dried when Ethan Cole realized he hadn't just discarded a quiet, unremarkable wife. He had severed ties with the architect of his entire empire. He stood in the opulent ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, his glass of expensive scotch trembling in his grip as the spotlight suddenly hit the grand staircase. The elusive billionaire he had spent 3 grueling years desperately trying to court was finally making her public debut. The whispers in the room died, the applause swelled, and Ethan felt the blood violently drain from his face as Clara, the woman he had thrown away for being too ordinary, descended the steps dripping in diamonds that cost more than his entire company. The rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Simon Rostover's high-rise law office in Manhattan, a stark contrast to the stifling, sterile silence inside the room. The mahogany table felt as vast as an ocean, dividing the room into 2 distinct battle lines. On one side sat Ethan Cole, a man who wore his newly minted millions like a tailor-made suit. His jaw was set in a hard, arrogant line, his posture radiating the impatience of a man who believed his time was worth thousands of dollars a minute. Beside him, clinging to his bicep like a barnacle in a designer dress, was Beatrice Croft. Beatrice was a socialite of minor standing but major ambitions, her lips painted a severe scarlet, her eyes darting across the room with thinly veiled triumph. On the other side of the table sat Clara. She wore a simple, unbranded beige trench coat over a modest navy dress. Her dark hair was tied back in a practical, unpretentious clasp. To Ethan, Clara looked exactly as she had for the last 5 years. Dull, reliable, and utterly devoid of the spark required to survive in his cutthroat world. She was the woman who packed his lunches when he was working out of a garage, the woman who quietly paid the electric bill when his first startup failed. But now, Ethan was the CEO of Cole Innovations. He was a titan of Silicon Alley, rubbing shoulders with politicians and hedge fund managers. Clara, in his eyes, was an anchor holding him in the past. If we can review Section 4, Simon Rostover, Ethan's high-powered divorce attorney, said, clearing his throat uncomfortably. He slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. Mrs. Cole, as per the prenuptial agreement drafted prior to the company's valuation explosion, you are entitled to a lump sum of $200,000 and the modest property in Queens. Beatrice scoffed, a soft, mocking sound that she didn't bother to hide. She leaned over to Ethan, whispering loudly enough to be heard. She should be grateful. Most men wouldn't be so generous to a woman who contributed nothing to the business. Ethan didn't correct her. Instead, he looked at Clara with a gaze that mixed pity with profound detachment. Clara, I want to make this as painless as possible. You have to understand, my life has changed. My circle has changed. Cole Innovations is going global. I need a partner who understands corporate diplomacy, who can host galas, who speaks the language of the elite. You prefer staying home with a book. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. The absolute stillness in her deep brown eyes was unnerving, though Ethan was too blind in his arrogance to notice it. She picked up the Mont Blanc pen resting beside the documents. I don't want the house, Ethan, Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, smooth as glass, and I don't want the $200,000. Simon Rostover frowned, adjusting his spectacles. Mrs. Cole, I must advise you to seek independent counsel. Waiving these assets leaves you with virtually nothing from a marriage that lasted 5 years. I have nothing to contest, Clara replied, her gaze finally meeting Ethan's. For a fleeting second, Ethan thought he saw a spark of something incredibly cold, something calculating, flash in her eyes. But he blinked, and it was gone. Just plain old Clara again. Ethan built his empire. Let him keep every single cent of it. Beatrice smiled, looking like the cat that had swallowed the canary. Well, that settles it, doesn't it, Ethan, darling? She knows she doesn't deserve it. "Beatrice, please," Ethan murmured, feigning chivalry, though he was secretly relieved. A messy public divorce could have tanked his upcoming IPO. Clara's docility was a godsend. "Are you absolutely certain, Clara?" Ethan asked, leaning forward, trying to project magnanimity. "I can wire the money today. It's a drop in the bucket for me now. I don't want you starving on the streets." "I will manage," Clara said quietly. She uncapped the pen and flipped to the signature page. She didn't hesitate. She didn't read the fine print. She signed her name with swift, elegant strokes. But as Simon pulled the papers back to inspect the signatures, his brow furrowed. She hadn't signed Clara Cole. She had signed Clara Hayes. "Ma'am, you used your maiden name," Simon pointed out, tapping the paper. "That is my name," Clara said, standing up and smoothing out her coat. "The Cole name no longer applies to me. I assume you can file the paperwork regardless." Yes, technically," Simon stammered, intimidated for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. Clara looked at Ethan one last time. There was no bitterness, no anger, only a chilling finality. "Goodbye, Ethan. I genuinely hope you and Beatrice find exactly what you deserve." Before Ethan could formulate a response, she turned and walked out of the office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Ethan exhaled a long breath, slumping back into his leather chair. He felt lighter. The dead weight was gone. He turned to Beatrice, pulling her into a kiss. "It's done," he whispered. "We're free. Now we take over the world." What Ethan Cole did not know, what he could not possibly have fathomed in his wildest, most ambitious dreams, was that the woman who just walked out of his life was the sole reason he had a world to take over in the first place. 3 months had passed since the divorce was finalized. Ethan had moved Beatrice into his sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, upgraded her wardrobe, and introduced her to the New York elite as his fiancée. On the surface, life was a photograph of absolute perfection. Behind the mahogany doors of the Cole Innovations boardroom, however, Ethan's world was quietly catching fire. "What do you mean they pulled the contract?" Ethan slammed his fist against the glass table, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. His chief financial officer, David Harrison, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Exactly what I said, Ethan. Apex Global terminated the supply chain agreement this morning, effective immediately. They invoked a morality and instability clause." "Instability? We are a billion-dollar tech firm," Ethan roared, pacing the length of the room. "Apex Global has been our primary supplier since day one. We had an unbreakable relationship with them. Who approved this?" "That's the problem," David stammered, pulling up a file on his tablet. "Apex Global is just a subsidiary. I did some digging. They are owned by a shell company, which is owned by a holding group, which ultimately leads back to the Hayes-Whitman conglomerate." Ethan stopped pacing. The name sent a chill down his spine. Hayes-Whitman was an apex predator in the global market, a massive conglomerate dealing in tech, shipping, real estate, and banking. They were old money, ruthless, and entirely untouchable. "Why would Hayes-Whitman care about us?" Ethan demanded. "I don't know, but it's not just Apex," David said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "Our angel investor, the anonymous backer who funded our Series A and B rounds, they pulled their backing 2 months ago. The bank is getting nervous. If we don't secure the new microchip patents from the Sterling Group by the end of the quarter, Cole Innovations will default on its loans. We will be bankrupt in 6 months, Ethan." Ethan sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. The timing was entirely bizarre. For 5 years, every business gamble he took had miraculously paid off. Doors opened for him as if by magic. Contracts were signed with minimal negotiation. He had truly believed it was his own sheer brilliance, his unmatched charisma. Now suddenly, every door was slamming shut in his face. It was as if a massive, invisible safety net had been violently yanked out from under him. "The winter solstice ball is tonight," Ethan said softly, his eyes narrowing as a desperate plan formed. "The charity gala at the Pierre?" David asked. "Yes. Richard Hayes, the patriarch of the Hayes-Whitman Empire, will be there. More importantly, rumors are swirling that the elusive CEO of the Sterling Group, the subsidiary holding the patents we need, is making their first public appearance tonight." Ethan stood up, adjusting his tie, his arrogant facade snapping back into place. "I just need 5 minutes in a room with them. Once they see the projections for Cole Innovations, they'll sign. I'm a self-made titan. They respect that." David looked entirely unconvinced, but nodded anyway. "Don't mess this up, Ethan. Your company's life depends on it." That evening, the Pierre Hotel was a fortress of wealth and exclusivity. Black SUVs lined Fifth Avenue, discharging billionaires, politicians, and A-list celebrities onto the red carpet. The ballroom was draped in winter-white orchids, crystal chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow over the diamonds and designer gowns of the attendees. Ethan arrived with Beatrice clinging to his arm. She was wearing a violently expensive, heavily sequined emerald gown that seemed designed to blind onlookers. She posed dramatically for the society photographers, basking in the flashbulbs, entirely ignorant of the financial guillotine hovering over her fiancé's neck. "Ethan, darling, look," Beatrice purred, nodding toward a velvet-roped VIP section near the grand staircase. "That's Richard Hayes, and the governor is with him." Ethan's eyes locked onto the 80-year-old billionaire. Richard Hayes possessed a terrifying presence, leaning on a silver-tipped cane, his sharp eyes missing nothing. This was Ethan's target. "Wait here, B," Ethan instructed, straightening his tuxedo jacket. "I need to do some networking. Do not cause a scene." "Excuse me?" Beatrice bristled, but Ethan was already walking away. Ethan approached the VIP area with practiced confidence, plastering his most charming smile onto his face. He waited for a lull in the conversation before stepping forward. "Mr. Hayes, an absolute honor. Ethan Cole, CEO of Cole Innovations. I've been a massive admirer of your conglomerate's infrastructure expansions." Richard Hayes slowly turned his head. His piercing blue eyes swept over Ethan from head to toe. The older man didn't smile. He didn't extend his hand. He simply stared, a look of profound, icy disgust settling on his weathered features. "Cole," Richard Hayes said, his voice gravelly and low, carrying a dangerous weight. "I know exactly who you are." Ethan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh, excellent. Then perhaps you know I'm very interested in a partnership with your Sterling Group division. I believe my firm—" "You believe a lot of things about yourself, Mr. Cole," Richard interrupted, his tone laced with absolute contempt. "Most of them are fictions. You are a man standing on a foundation built by someone else, boasting about the height of the roof." Ethan blinked, taken aback by the hostility. "Excuse me? I built my company from the ground up." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. He turned back to the governor, deliberately turning his back on Ethan. "As I was saying, Governor, loyalty is the only currency that matters in this world. A man who throws away a diamond to pick up a glittering rock is a fool not worth doing business with." The dismissal was absolute. Ethan stood frozen, his face burning with humiliation. Several nearby executives had overheard the exchange and were casting amused, pitying glances his way. Ethan retreated, his mind racing. Why did Richard Hayes hate him? What did he mean by throwing away a diamond? He made his way back to Beatrice, his hands trembling slightly. "Did you get the meeting?" she asked, oblivious to his pale complexion. "No. He brushed me off," Ethan muttered, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downing it in one gulp. "It doesn't matter. The CEO of the Sterling Group is the one I really need. If I can bypass the old man and talk to the subsidiary head directly." Suddenly the gentle hum of the string quartet faded out. The master of ceremonies, a distinguished man in tails, stepped up to the microphone at the base of the grand staircase. The ballroom fell utterly silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," The MC's voice echoed through the massive room. "Tonight is a momentous occasion. For 3 years, the Sterling Group has revolutionized the tech and shipping industries under the brilliant, albeit anonymous, guidance of its founder. Tonight, she steps out of the shadows to accept the Humanitarian of the Year award. Please give a warm welcome to the CEO of the Sterling Group and the sole heiress to the Hayes-Whitman conglomerate." Ethan held his breath, ready to memorize the face of his potential savior, Miss Clara Hayes. The spotlights converged on the top of the grand sweeping staircase. Ethan's heart completely stopped. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. But the sound was drowned out by the thunderous applause of 500 billionaires. Standing at the top of the stairs was not the quiet, mousy woman in the beige trench coat. It was Clara. She wore a breathtaking, custom-made, midnight blue gown that draped perfectly over her figure. Around her neck rested a flawless, staggering sapphire necklace that practically radiated power. Her hair was styled in an elegant, sweeping updo, and her makeup was razor-sharp, enhancing the fierce, calculating intelligence in her deep brown eyes, the intelligence Ethan had been too arrogant to see. She wasn't just wealthy. She was royalty in this room. As Clara began her descent, the titans of industry, men who had ignored Ethan all night, bowed their heads respectfully. Richard Hayes stepped forward at the bottom of the stairs, extending a proud hand to help his granddaughter down the final step. Ethan couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. The pieces of the puzzle crashed together in his mind with devastating, violent force. Clara Hayes, the anonymous angel investor who funded his company. Apex Global, the supplier who gave him unprecedented deals. The sudden catastrophic collapse of his business the moment he divorced her. She hadn't just packed his lunches. She had secretly orchestrated his entire rise to power, playing the role of a quiet wife while manipulating the global market to ensure his success. And for Beatrice Croft, he had thrown her away. Clara stepped to the microphone. Her eyes swept the room, commanding absolute silence. And then her gaze locked directly onto Ethan Cole. A slow, devastatingly cold smile touched her lips. The microphone let out a brief, sharp whine before Clara's voice filled the cavernous ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. It was the same voice that used to remind Ethan to take his umbrella, the same voice that softly read novels on their worn-out sofa while he furiously typed code at the kitchen table. But now, amplified and echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling, it carried the weight and authority of a titan. "Thank you, grandfather, for that introduction," Clara began, her tone perfectly modulated, projecting a quiet power that commanded absolute attention. "And thank you to the board of the Sterling Group. For the past 3 years, I have preferred to let our work speak for itself. In the world of global logistics and technology, the foundation is everything. If the foundation is solid, you can weather any storm. If it is built on arrogance, deceit, or the uncredited labor of others, it is only a matter of time before the structure collapses." A ripple of knowing murmurs swept through the crowd. In the elite circles of New York's billionaires, information was currency. Many of the executives in the room had already connected the dots. They knew Ethan Cole. They knew he had recently divorced his quiet, seemingly insignificant wife. And now they were witnessing the public execution of his career. Ethan felt the collective weight of 100 side glances bearing down on him. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, suffocating. His hands, still wet from the champagne he had dropped, shook violently. "Ethan, what is she talking about?" Beatrice hissed, tugging at his tuxedo sleeve. Her heavily contoured face was scrunched in confusion. "Why is your mousy ex-wife on the stage? Is this some kind of sick joke?" "Shut up, Beatrice," Ethan snapped, the words tearing from his throat with a viciousness that made her recoil. He couldn't look at her. Looking at Beatrice meant acknowledging the colossal, reality-shattering mistake he had just made. He had traded a queen for a pawn. Clara continued, her eyes sweeping the room but deliberately avoiding Ethan's corner. It was a calculated move. She wouldn't even grant him the dignity of her direct attention. The Sterling Group has always operated on a simple philosophy. We invest in character as heavily as we invest in innovation. Moving forward, we are restructuring our portfolios. We are severing ties with entities that lack integrity, and we are redirecting our capital to visionaries who understand the value of loyalty. The applause that followed was deafening. Clara smiled gracefully, handed the microphone back to the MC, and began to navigate the sea of billionaires who surged forward to shake her hand. Governors, media moguls, and venture capitalists practically tripped over themselves to greet her. Ethan couldn't just stand there. Panic, hot and blinding, overrode his common sense. He shoved his way through the crowd, ignoring Beatrice's indignant squawk as he left her behind. He needed to talk to Clara. He needed to explain. He needed to make her understand that the divorce was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. "Clara!" Ethan called out, his voice cracking as he breached the inner circle of the VIP section. "Clara, please!" Before he could get within 10 feet of her, a wall of solid muscle materialized in his path. It was a man in a tailored charcoal suit, wearing an earpiece and an expression of polite violence. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," the security chief said, his voice low but leaving no room for negotiation. Clara, who was mid-conversation with the CEO of a major European bank, paused. She turned slowly, the flawless sapphire resting against her collarbone, catching the chandelier's light. Her expression was entirely unreadable. She murmured an apology to the banker and took 2 measured steps toward Ethan. The security chief stepped aside, though he kept a vigilant eye on Ethan's twitching hands. "Ethan," Clara said simply. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. Up close, the transformation was even more staggering. The subtle scent of her perfume, something custom, smelling of cedar and vanilla, was intoxicating. She didn't look like an ex-wife. She looked like a predator observing a trapped mouse. "Clara, I didn't know," Ethan stammered, his carefully curated CEO persona disintegrating into a pathetic display of desperation. "The Angel Investments, Apex Global. You built my company." "No, Ethan," Clara corrected, her voice soft enough that only he and the security guard could hear. "You built the software. I simply built the entire world that allowed your software to survive. I bought your servers. I bribed your early detractors to give you a second look. I manipulated the supply chain so you could manufacture at a fraction of the cost. I gave you the illusion of genius so you could thrive." Ethan felt his knees go weak. "Why didn't you tell me? If I had known who you were, what you were worth. If you had known my last name, you would have loved the Hayes-Whitman empire, not me," Clara interrupted, her eyes narrowing with a flash of genuine disdain. "I wanted a partner, Ethan. I wanted someone who loved me in a beige coat, in a tiny apartment in Queens. I wanted to see what kind of man you would become when you were handed the world." She tilted her head, a cold smile playing on her lips. "And I saw exactly who you became. The moment you thought you didn't need me, you discarded me for a woman who looks like a walking chandelier. You failed the test, Ethan." "I can fix this," Ethan pleaded, reaching a hand out, though he didn't dare touch her. "Clara, we were married for 5 years. We have history. I was wrong. I was blinded by the stress, the new environment. Beatrice means nothing to me. We can tear up the divorce papers. We can—" Clara actually laughed. It was a chilling, melodic sound that drove a spike of ice straight into Ethan's chest. "Tear up the papers? Ethan, you couldn't afford to take me to dinner right now, let alone marry me," Clara said smoothly. "My lawyer, Simon Rostova, drafted that prenuptial agreement specifically to ensure that if you ever showed your true colors, I could walk away cleanly. You waived all rights to my assets because you thought you were the rich one." Ethan felt a physical pain in his chest, a sickening lurch as he remembered his own arrogant words in the law office. Let him keep every single cent of it. "As for your company," Clara continued, her tone shifting from personal to strictly professional, Your CFO should be receiving an email shortly. The Sterling Group is recalling the patent licenses we leased to Cole Innovations. You have 30 days to cease utilizing our proprietary microchip architecture." "You can't do that," Ethan gasped, his voice pitching up in panic. "That architecture is in 80% of our hardware. We'll have to halt production entirely. It will bankrupt us." "I am well aware of the math, Ethan. I wrote the algorithm that scales your production," Clara replied, her eyes devoid of any pity. She turned away, dismissing him with the casual grace of a monarch dismissing a peasant. "Goodbye, Ethan. I told you I hoped you and Beatrice would find exactly what you deserve. It seems you're about to." Clara walked away, disappearing into the crowd of adoring sycophants. Ethan stood completely frozen, a dead man walking in a tailored tuxedo, as the reality of his impending ruin crashed down upon him. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological and financial torture. The glittering facade of Cole Innovations crumbled with terrifying speed. Without the Sterling Group's patents, Ethan's assembly lines in Taiwan ground to a screeching halt. The news of Apex Global pulling their supply chain contract leaked to the press, causing Cole's stock to nosedive by 40% in a single afternoon. Ethan's penthouse, once a sanctuary of modern luxury, had become a war room. Empty coffee cups and crumpled financial printouts littered the custom marble countertops. "They won't take my calls, Ethan," David Harrison, his CFO, said over the speakerphone, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "The banks, 3 different lenders, have frozen our credit lines. They're citing the morality and instability clause that Apex used. It's a coordinated freeze-out. Someone is terrifying the banks into blacklisting us." "It's Clara," Ethan muttered, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the gala. "She's utilizing the Hayes-Whitman influence. She's starving us out." "Ethan, if we can't make payroll by Friday, the engineers are going to walk. We need an emergency injection of capital, at least 50 million, or we are filing for Chapter 11 by Monday." "I'll get the money," Ethan lied, hanging up the phone. He looked across the living room. Beatrice was sprawled on the velvet sofa, scrolling on her phone, wearing a silk robe that cost more than Ethan's first car. She looked up, her expression sour. "My black card was declined at Bergdorf's today, Ethan," she complained, her voice nasal and grating. "The cashier looked at me like I was a criminal. You promised me this cash flow problem was temporary." Ethan stared at her, a profound sense of revulsion washing over him. It wasn't just that she was shallow. It was that she represented his own catastrophic stupidity. He had thrown away a billionaire genius for a woman who couldn't even spell the word portfolio. "The company is going under, Beatrice," Ethan said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We are out of money. The penthouse is leveraged. The cars are leased. If I don't pull a miracle out of thin air by Friday, I will be completely broke." Beatrice froze. The phone slowly lowered. The faux affection she usually plastered on her face vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating glint. "Broke?" she repeated softly. "Bankrupt," Ethan confirmed. Beatrice didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, walked into the master bedroom, and began aggressively pulling designer suitcases from the top of the closet. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, standing in the doorway. "I signed up to be a CEO's wife, Ethan, not a charity case," she said, viciously throwing dresses into a trunk. "I have my own reputation to maintain. If you're going down, I'm not letting you drag me into the mud. Tristan Vance invited me to his yacht in Saint-Tropez next week anyway." Ethan didn't even have the energy to fight. He watched her pack, feeling nothing but a hollow, echoing emptiness. When she finally rolled her luggage out the front door, without so much as a backward glance, the silence in the penthouse was deafening. He was entirely alone. Desperation is a powerful motivator. Stripped of his pride, his fiancée, and his impending wealth, Ethan realized there was only one card left to play. He had to beg, The Hayes-Whitman Tower was a monolithic structure of black glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. Ethan felt like an ant as he walked through the cavernous, vaulted lobby. He didn't have an appointment, but when he approached the security desk, the guard simply nodded, as if expecting him. "Top floor, Mr. Cole. Miss Hayes is waiting." The private elevator shot up 60 floors in silence. When the doors parted, Ethan stepped into a sprawling executive suite that made his own office look like a supply closet. The walls were lined with original modern art, and a massive wall of windows offered a dizzying view of the Manhattan skyline. Clara sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark, polished oak. She was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal pantsuit, reviewing a tablet with a silver stylus. Standing beside her was a tall, strikingly handsome man with piercing green eyes, Nathaniel Pierce, her chief operating officer. Clara didn't look up when Ethan entered. "You have exactly 3 minutes, Ethan. Nathaniel is timing you." Ethan swallowed his pride, stepping forward. "Clara, please. I have nothing left. Beatrice is gone. The banks have locked me out. My employees are going to lose their livelihoods. Punish me, fine. But don't destroy the company. We built it together." Clara finally looked up, setting the stylus down. "We didn't build it together, Ethan. I built the infrastructure. You took the credit. And as for your employees, you don't need to worry about them." Ethan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Clara gestured for Nathaniel to hand her a thick manila folder. She slid it across the vast expanse of the oak desk. "Take a look, Ethan." Ethan approached the desk, his hands trembling as he opened the folder. Inside were financial documents, bank transfers, and a legal contract stamped with the seal of the SEC. He scanned the dense legal jargon, his eyes widening in horror as he realized what he was looking at. "You didn't just freeze my credit," Ethan whispered, the blood rushing in his ears. "No," Clara said softly, leaning back in her leather chair, her fingers steepled. "I bought your debt, all of it, from the mezzanine lenders, from the primary banks, even the private equity loans you took out last year to fund your vanity expansion into Europe. You own my debt?" "I am your sole creditor," Clara confirmed, her voice utterly devoid of mercy. "And as of 9 a.m. this morning, Cole Innovations is in technical default, which means, according to the covenants of those loans, the creditor has the right to seize the underlying collateral." Ethan dropped the folder, stumbling back a step. "The collateral is the company's intellectual property. My code. My algorithms." "Exactly," Clara said, a shark-like smile crossing her face. "I am initiating a hostile takeover. By Monday, Cole Innovations will be a subsidiary of the Sterling Group. I will absorb your engineers, your tech, and your market share. And you, Ethan, will be legally removed as CEO." "You can't do this!" Ethan shouted, slamming his hands onto the edge of her desk. Nathaniel immediately stepped forward, but Clara held up a hand to stop him. "I can, and I have," Clara replied, her dark eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "You threw me away because you wanted a life of power and ruthlessness. You wanted to swim with the sharks, Ethan. Well, welcome to the deep end." "Please," Ethan begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, stripping away the last remnants of his dignity. "I'll do anything. I'll step down as CEO. Just let me keep a board seat. Let me keep my shares. Don't leave me with nothing." Clara stood up, smoothing the front of her suit jacket. She walked around the desk, stopping just inches from him. The scent of cedar and vanilla was overpowering now, a mocking reminder of everything he had lost. "When we sat in Simon Rostover's office," Clara whispered, her voice lethally soft, "I asked you if you were absolutely certain. I gave you one final chance to show an ounce of decency, an ounce of the man I thought I married. You looked at me with pity. You offered me a pathetic $200,000 for 5 years of my life, and you took everything else." She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear. "I am simply returning the favor, Ethan. You leave this building with exactly what you gave me. Nothing. The eviction notice was printed on cheap, garish pink paper. It was taped carelessly to the custom mahogany door of Ethan's penthouse, a glaring, ugly blemish on his carefully curated world. It took exactly 72 hours for Clara's hostile takeover to dismantle the life Ethan had built. By Wednesday, Cole Innovations was officially a subsidiary of the Sterling Group. By Thursday, the board of directors, men Ethan had handpicked, men he thought were loyal to him, unanimously voted to remove him as chief executive officer, citing gross financial mismanagement. And by Friday evening, the private wealth management division of J.P. Morgan Chase had frozen his personal accounts to cover the collateral damage of his leveraged assets. Ethan packed whatever he could fit into 2 duffel bags. He left behind the bespoke Italian suits he could no longer afford to dry clean, the collection of vintage Rolex watches that were already slated for auction by the bank, and the sprawling views of Central Park that had fueled his ego for the past 3 years. He moved into a cramped, aggressively mediocre 1-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, a neighborhood ironically only 10 blocks from the house he had tried to dump on Clara during the divorce settlement. At first, Ethan's arrogance shielded him from the reality of his situation. He was a Silicon Alley titan, a man who had graced the cover of Wired and Fast Company. He convinced himself that losing the company was a temporary setback. He was still the visionary. He still had the mind that created the proprietary scaling algorithms. All he needed was a whiteboard, a fresh pot of coffee, and a little seed money to build Cole 2.0. He spent the first month relentlessly calling in favors. He reached out to contacts at Sequoia Capital and Andreessen Horowitz, the very venture capital firms that had aggressively courted him a year prior. He promised them the next evolution of machine learning architecture. Finally, Jonathan Reed, a senior partner at a top-tier venture firm on Sand Hill Road, agreed to a Zoom pitch meeting. Ethan spent 3 days preparing his deck, fueled by cheap diner coffee and sheer, desperate adrenaline. When the call connected, Ethan launched into his presentation with the practiced charisma he had relied on for years. But 10 minutes in, Jonathan raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Ethan, I'm going to stop you right there," Jonathan said, his tone carrying a distinct note of impatience. "We ran a preliminary due diligence on the technical specs you sent over yesterday. I had my lead engineers at Palantir look at the underlying code architecture you're proposing." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "And? It's revolutionary, isn't it?" Jonathan sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Ethan, it's a mess. The latency projections are wildly optimistic, and your neural network routing is derivative at best. Frankly, it's full of memory leaks. My guys said this looks like the work of a second-year undergrad who hasn't grasped load balancing." "That's impossible," Ethan snapped, his defensive instincts flaring. "My algorithms powered Cole Innovations for 3 years. We processed millions of transactions a second." "Yes, you did," Jonathan countered smoothly. "But we've been watching the Sterling Group's recent filings since they acquired your IP. The industry consensus is that the code keeping Cole afloat wasn't yours. The architecture was patched, optimized, and practically rewritten from the ground up by an anonymous senior developer 3 years ago. We all assumed it was you. But seeing this new pitch, it's obvious it wasn't." Ethan sat frozen in his cheap desk chair. "What are you saying, Jonathan?" "I'm saying that whatever magic was happening at Cole Innovations, it left the building when Clara Hayes stepped out of the shadows," Jonathan said bluntly. "You're a good salesman, Ethan, but you aren't a technical genius, and without the Hayes-Whitman safety net, you're just another guy with a buggy pitch deck. We're going to pass. Best of luck." The screen went black. Ethan stared at his reflection in the dark monitor. The silence in his tiny apartment was suffocating. He slowly opened a drawer and pulled out an old, scuffed external hard drive, a relic from the very first days of his startup, back when he and Clara shared a makeshift office in their living room. He plugged the drive into his laptop and booted up the archived GitHub repository. He navigated to the core commit history of his original software, the software he thought he had built entirely on his own. His eyes scanned the logs. Commit 402, memory leak patched. Commit 408, complete restructure of load balancing framework. Commit 415, algorithm rewrite for scaling efficiency. Every single one of the critical foundational commits, the brilliant strokes of code that had made the software functional and scalable, was logged under a user named C_Hayes. They were submitted at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. While Ethan had been sleeping, dreaming of wealth and magazine covers, Clara had been quietly fixing his mistakes. She hadn't just built the corporate infrastructure. She had physically built the product he paraded as his own. The realization hit Ethan with the physical force of a sledgehammer. He wasn't a fallen genius. He was a fraud. He had always been a fraud, propped up by the quiet brilliance of the woman he had discarded for being too ordinary. Ethan put his head in his hands, and for the first time since the divorce, he wept. 6 months later, the bitter New York winter had thawed into a humid, oppressive summer. Ethan Cole, former billionaire and tech prodigy, was now a mid-level database manager for a regional logistics company in New Jersey. He spent his days debugging inventory software and his evenings eating takeout in his sweltering Queens apartment. The sharp, arrogant edge that had defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted exhaustion. He avoided the news. He uninstalled LinkedIn. He couldn't bear to look at the financial world that had moved on so swiftly without him. But escaping Clara Hayes was impossible. She was everywhere. She was on the cover of Forbes, hailed as the most influential woman in global tech. She was giving keynote speeches at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The Sterling Group, utilizing the perfectly optimized remnants of Cole Innovations, had just secured a multi-billion-dollar defense contract with the Pentagon. Clara had taken Ethan's shattered company and turned it into an empire. One humid Thursday afternoon, Ethan's manager dispatched him to the Javits Center in Manhattan to attend a logistics trade show. His job was mind-numbingly simple: scan badges and sit at a folding table to hand out promotional lanyards for his new, utterly unremarkable employer. Ethan sat at his booth wearing an ill-fitting polo shirt that bore his company's logo. He kept his head down, praying he wouldn't run into anyone from his past life. Suddenly, a shift in the atmosphere swept through the massive convention hall. The low murmur of thousands of attendees swelled into an excited buzz. A crowd of reporters, executives, and photographers began moving like a tidal wave down the main aisle. Ethan looked up. Walking at the center of the phalanx, flanked by her COO Nathaniel Pierce and a team of security, was Clara. She looked radiant, exuding an aura of absolute, unshakable power. She was wearing a tailored ivory suit, engaged in a vibrant conversation with the CEO of Microsoft, who was nodding intently at every word she said. She wasn't just wealthy. She was consequential. She was shaping the future. Ethan felt a magnetic, sickening pull. Before he could stop himself, he stood up from his folding table. He abandoned the stack of cheap lanyards and walked toward the edge of the aisle, drawn to the life he had so callously thrown away. He didn't want to beg this time. He just wanted to look at her. He wanted to see if there was even a flicker of the woman who used to smile at him across a kitchen table. As the entourage passed, Ethan stepped slightly out of the crowd. "Clara," he breathed, the word barely audible over the noise of the convention center. Clara didn't hear him. She didn't even look in his direction. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, entirely consumed by the massive, global stakes of her world. She walked past him like he was a ghost, a completely invisible entity in a sea of nameless faces. But someone else did see him. David Harrison, Ethan's former CFO, who was now proudly wearing a badge that read Vice President of Global Finance, Sterling Group, caught sight of Ethan. David paused, letting the entourage walk ahead, and stepped over to where Ethan was standing. David looked at Ethan's cheap polo shirt, the dark circles under his eyes, and the defeated slump of his shoulders. There was no malice in David's eyes, only a profound, crushing pity. "David," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Hello, Ethan," David replied softly. She looks incredible," Ethan murmured, his eyes still tracking Clara's retreating figure. "She is," David said. "She's brilliant, Ethan. Truly. She treats the team with respect. She listens to our input, and she works harder than any of us. The company has never been healthier." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I saw the code, David. The old commit logs. I saw what she did." David nodded slowly. "I figured you'd find out eventually. When she acquired the company, she sat the executive team down and showed us everything. She proved that she wrote the core architecture. She didn't do it to humiliate you, Ethan. She did it to assure the board that the real talent was still in the building." Ethan flinched as if he had been struck. Does she ever talk about me?" David looked at him, and for a moment Ethan hoped for anger. He hoped that Clara hated him, that she cursed his name, that he at least occupied a space in her mind, even a negative one. "No, Ethan," David said, delivering the most devastating blow of all. "She never mentions you. It's like you never existed. You were just a bad investment she finally wrote off." David offered a tight, polite smile, adjusted his expensive suit jacket, and turned to jog back to Clara's entourage. Ethan was left standing alone in the middle of the convention hall. The truth settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He hadn't just lost a wife, a fortune, or a company. He had lost his entire identity. He was a man who had been handed a winning lottery ticket, only to tear it to shreds because he thought the paper wasn't shiny enough. He slowly turned around and walked back to his folding table. He sat down, picked up a cheap plastic lanyard, and stared blankly at the wall, finally understanding the true, unbearable weight of his regret. 2 years later, the relentless churn of New York City had entirely forgotten Ethan Cole. He sat in a vinyl booth at a remarkably grim diner on Ditmars Boulevard in Queens, nursing a mug of lukewarm, bitter coffee. The rain lashed against the greasy window pane, a violent, rhythmic drumming that perfectly mirrored the day he had sat in Simon Rostover's mahogany-lined office and gleefully signed away his salvation. Ethan was 34, but the deep, permanent lines etched into his face made him look 50. His expensive haircuts and tailored suits had been replaced by a frayed grey sweater and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who worked 60 hours a week managing server maintenance for a mid-level retail chain. He was surviving, but he was not living. Every day was a monotonous loop of regret, a quiet purgatory entirely of his own making. Above the diner's pie display case, a small, static-filled television was tuned to a prime-time financial news network. Normally, Ethan would have asked the waitress to change the channel. He avoided business news like a plague, terrified of seeing the empire he had forfeited. But tonight the remote was lost, and the diner was empty, save for him and Brenda, a tired waitress wiping down the counter. The program cut from a commercial break to an exclusive sit-down interview. The camera panned across a sleek, minimalist studio before settling on the host, a veteran journalist named Thomas Vining. Sitting across from him, looking impossibly poised in a tailored maroon blazer, was Clara Hayes. Ethan's breath hitched. He set his coffee mug down so hard it chipped the heavy ceramic rim. He couldn't look away. "Miss Hayes, the Sterling Group's recent acquisition of the European logistics giant, Kalin Gothard, has solidified your position as the undisputed architect of modern supply chain technology," Thomas Vining said, his tone laced with deep reverence. "But you remain incredibly private about your origins. You emerged seemingly out of nowhere 3 years ago to take the reins of your grandfather's conglomerate. But before that, there is a 5-year gap where you were practically a ghost." Clara smiled, a small, serene expression that held no arrogance, only quiet confidence. I wasn't a ghost, Thomas. I was simply building. Building what? Thomas pressed, leaning forward. Rumors have circulated for years that you were the uncredited genius behind a major Silicon Alley startup that famously collapsed right around the time you took over the Sterling Group, a company founded by your ex-husband. Ethan froze. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. For 2 years, he had waited for her to publicly humiliate him, to drag his name through the mud and expose him as the fraud he was. He braced himself, gripping the edge of the laminate table until his knuckles turned white. "I have never publicly addressed my first marriage," Clara said smoothly, her voice betraying absolutely no emotion. "But I will say this. When I was 22, I made a choice that infuriated my grandfather, Richard Hayes. He believed wealth should be inherited and managed. I believed it should be innovated. When I refused to take a safe, predetermined role at the conglomerate, he cut me off entirely. I was stripped of my trust fund, my name, and my safety net." Ethan stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He hadn't known any of this. When he met Clara, she was just a quiet girl working at a bookstore. He had assumed she was naturally poor. "So you started from the bottom," Thomas noted, fascinated. "I did," Clara nodded. "I lived in a tiny apartment in Queens. I budgeted groceries down to the penny, and in the middle of the night, while the world slept, I wrote code. I built a proprietary algorithm designed to revolutionize database load balancing. I poured my soul into it. But the man I was married to at the time was the charismatic one. He was the salesman. I let him be the face of the company because I loved him, and I believed we were a team." "What happened?" "Ego happened, Thomas," Clara replied, her dark eyes entirely unreadable. "When the company reached $1 billion valuation, he believed his own press. He convinced himself he was the sole architect of the success. He divorced me to align himself with a more suitable socialite. He offered me $200,000 to walk away quietly." Thomas Vining let out a low whistle. A $200,000 buyout for $1 billion algorithm. That is staggeringly insulting. What he didn't know, Clara continued, her voice dropping to a softer, more reflective register, was that the $200,000 he offered in that prenuptial agreement was actually exactly the amount I had left in my personal savings. It was my own money, earned from side consulting. I was prepared to let him keep the algorithm, the company, and the billions simply because I didn't want a war. I just wanted peace. Ethan felt a physical pain rip through his chest. She had been willing to let him win. If he had just shown a shred of grace, a shred of gratitude, she would have let him keep the empire. "But then my grandfather saw the algorithms," Clara said, a faint, fond smile touching her lips. "He recognized my coding signature. He realized I hadn't just survived outside his empire. I had built something that eclipsed it. He came to my apartment in Queens, apologized for doubting me, and handed me the keys to the Sterling Group." "And the rest is history," Thomas said. "Do you ever think about him? The ex-husband who threw away the most powerful woman in tech?" Ethan stopped breathing. He waited for the anger, the resentment, the vindication. Clara looked directly into the camera. For a fleeting second, Ethan felt as if she was staring right through the television screen, right into the dingy Queen's diner, pinning him to the vinyl booth. "No," Clara said softly, with absolute, terrifying sincerity. "I don't. Hatred requires energy, Thomas. Resentment requires an emotional investment." He was a lesson I had to learn about the dangers of misplaced trust. Once I learned the lesson, I closed the book. He is simply a stranger I used to know. The screen cut to a commercial for luxury sedans. Ethan sat in the diner, utterly destroyed. He was not her great nemesis. He was not her white whale. he was just a footnote, a rounding error in the magnificent, sweeping ledger of her life. "Hey, buddy," Brenda the waitress called out, tapping her pen against her notepad. "We're closing up in 10. You need anything else?" Ethan looked away from the blank, static screen. He looked at his calloused hands, at his cheap sweater, at the greasy laminate table that was now his entire world. The illusion was finally, completely dead. "No," Ethan whispered, pulling a crumpled $10 bill from his pocket and leaving it on the table. "I have exactly what I deserve." He stood up, pushed open the glass door of the diner, and walked out into the freezing, unforgiving rain, disappearing into the shadows of a city owned entirely by the woman he had thrown away. Ethan Cole's story is a stark, devastating reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most essential. In his relentless pursuit of status and vanity, he became blinded by his own hubris, failing to recognize that true power often operates in silence. Clara Hayes didn't just build his empire. She built the very foundation of his reality, asking for nothing in return but genuine partnership. When he discarded her for a superficial illusion, he didn't just lose a wife, he severed his connection to his own potential. The ultimate tragedy of Ethan's life was not the loss of his immense wealth, but the crushing, inescapable realization that he had held a priceless diamond in his hands, only to crush it because he was too ignorant to recognize its worth. He was left with nothing but the quiet, agonizing echo of his own colossal mistake.